you think you're alone right now, take a second look. You may not be as safe as you think. Something's watching you, right now, and it's closer than you realize. You're sitting there thinking everything is normal. The lights, the tree, the warmth of the season. But in the stillness of the night, it's the things we can't see that are the most dangerous. What happens when something enters your home? And it's not the spirit of Christmas, but something far darker. Subscribe now, or you'll regret not hearing the full story. Trust me, you may never feel safe again. In a forgotten part of the world, there lies a place called Winter's Hollow. Tucked away beneath a thick blanket of snow, surrounded by woods so dense they seem to choke out any sunlight, this town is isolated, abandoned by the living, and almost erased from time itself. Time doesn't flow here like it does in the rest of the world. Days stretch on forever, and nights come far too quickly. People speak in hushed tones about Winter's Hollow. They say that no one who goes there after dark ever returns, and those who do are never the same. Sarah, a weary journalist from the city, who arrived in Winter's Hollow on Christmas Eve, seeking answers about the strange disappearance of a local family. Their sudden vanishing had been the talk of the town, and with no leads or closure, Sarah couldn't resist the mystery. The town had always intrigued her, a place with a dark history that never seemed to age. What she didn't know, however, was that uncovering the truth would be the last thing on her mind. What lay ahead was not just a mystery, it was a nightmare waiting to unfold. The sun had already dipped behind the trees when Sarah arrived at the house. It was a decaying relic, covered in layers of snow and time, as if the earth itself was trying to bury it. The windows were dark, and there was a faint smell of pine, mixed with something stale. As Sarah stepped inside, the floor creaked beneath her, as though the house was whispering, groaning under the weight of its own history. It felt wrong, as if the air itself was heavy with the memories of those who had walked these halls before her. At first, everything seemed normal. The house was quiet, too quiet, but then she heard it, the faint sound of breathing, slow, labored, as if something, was hiding in the darkness. It wasn't her own breath. She froze, standing at the foot of the grand staircase. The air seemed to thicken, wrapping itself around her chest. Slowly, she turned to the corner of the room where the sound had come from. But there was nothing, no movement, no shadows, just an empty space. She continued deeper into the house, determined to find the answers she came for, but the atmosphere seemed to grow thicker with every step. The walls seemed to hum, as though they were alive, listening to her every movement. She reached for her phone to check the time, but just as her fingers grazed the screen, the phone rang. No name, no number, just a chilling static on the other end. Sarah hesitated, holding the phone to her ear for a beat too long before hanging up. A faint, distorted whisper clung to the line before it cut off entirely. "Shaking it off," Sarah continued. But then, a cold breeze brushed past her. It chilled her to the bone, though the windows had been shut tight. She spun around, but nothing was out of place. The warmth from her breath dissipated into the freezing air, yet the house refused to let go of its unwelcoming chill. That's when she saw it, the reflection in the window. A figure, thin, gaunt, standing in the darkness just beyond the glass. She turned quickly, her heart pounding, but when she faced the window, the reflection was gone. Nothing but the empty yard outside. But then, as Sarah moved down the hallway, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread creeping up her spine, she heard it. A sound so innocent, so wrong. A child's laughter, high-pitched, full of joy. But there was no child, not in the hallway, not in the house. It echoed through the hall, bouncing off the walls in a way that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She turned toward the sound, expecting to find a child playing in the next room, but the hallway was empty. The house was silent again. There was something in the air, something alive, watching her, waiting. Sarah's pulse quickened as she walked deeper into the house, each step heavier than the last. She reached the living room, where the fireplace was cold and dark. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, its lights dim and flickering. The ornaments seemed to shimmer in the fading light, but something about the tree, it felt off. The branches twisted unnaturally, like gnarled fingers reaching toward her. The lights blinked on and off, casting shadows that seemed to move with a will of their own. But then, As Sarah approached the tree, the whispering started again. This time, louder. It wasn't coming from the walls, it was coming from the tree itself. "Sarah, help." The voice pleaded, faint but unmistakable. The voice was Tommy's, the missing child, his voice. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen, the voice of the missing child still echoing in her ears, the air around her thick with the weight of something unspeakable. But she had to admit, she had to convince herself, it was just a trick of the mind. The stress, the isolation, the endless hours of driving through that cold, desolate winter landscape had worn her thin. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe the wind outside had played tricks on her. Or maybe, just maybe, the house was nothing more than an old relic haunted by memories of long-dead residents. Sarah let out a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. She glanced at the Christmas tree one last time, its lights flickering on and off as though winking at her, mocking her terror. No, she couldn't let this place get to her. She was here for a reason. She was here to find answers, and the more she searched, the closer she would get to uncovering the truth. She took another step into the living room, scanning the old furniture, the dusty shelves. The house seemed still again, as if the unsettling forces that had gripped it moments ago had momentarily loosened their hold. The faint hum of the fireplace's embers and the soft crackling of the logs filled the silence. It was peaceful, almost normal. Maybe it was all in her head. But just as she thought she was regaining control of her senses, it happened. A loud crash came from above, the unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the floor in the attic. The sound was sharp, loud, and sudden. It made Sarah's heart skip a beat. She stood frozen again, listening intently. The house seemed to hold its breath. No one was up there, no one but the dust and the darkness of the abandoned U upstairs. Her first instinct was to rush up, to investigate, to find out what had caused the noise, but her legs felt like lead. Something about the attic made her hesitate, a place of forgotten things, a place that hadn't seen light in years, the place that felt alive. Sarah swallowed hard, dismissing the fear that swelled in her chest. It's just the house settling, she told herself, trying to convince herself. It's just the house settling. She clenched her fists and continued moving through the hallway, deciding not to confront whatever lay above her just yet. The storm outside was growing stronger, she noticed. The wind had picked up, and the howling was beginning to cut through the walls of the house. Rain pelted the windows, and Sarah could hear the creak of the wooden beams as they groaned under the pressure of the storm. It was only natural, she thought, for old houses to respond to the weather this way. Old houses creaked, settled, sighed under the weight of time. It's just a storm, she muttered to herself. The storm is making everything worse. And she was right. It was a storm, a cold, bitter storm that seemed to have crept inside the house with her. The wind screeched against the windows, rattling the glass and making the shadows stretch in strange ways. It was only the wind, she told herself. The house was old, and it was tired. But the storm outside wasn't the only thing that was building. No, the real storm was inside. It had been gathering in the walls for years, quietly, slowly, silently. And now, it was ready to make itself known. The air grew thick again, heavier than before, as if the weight of the house had returned. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, more defined. The oppressive silence wrapped itself around Sarah like a suffocating blanket. Her breath quickened as her heartbeat thudded in her ears. She turned down another narrow hallway, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening here. Then, just when she thought she might be able to think straight again, she heard it. The whispering, soft, quiet. At first, it was almost imperceptible, like a distant murmur from across the room. But then it grew louder, clearer. Come closer, Sarah. The voice, it was familiar. It sounded like her own voice, calling her, beckoning her towards something she couldn't see. She froze, her mind racing. No, it couldn't be. The voice wasn't hers. It was something else, something that sounded like her, but wrong. The air was thick, and she felt as though it was closing in on her, the very walls of the house narrowing around her. The whispering continued. Come closer. It was now impossible to ignore. The voice sounded like it was coming from inside her own head, pulling her forward, urging her to step closer to something. Something dangerous. She stumbled forward, her body betraying her, each step feeling heavier than the last. She walked toward the old mirror hanging on the wall, a tarnished thing that hadn't seen a cloth in years. Her reflection stared back at her, but there was something off about it. Her image seemed distorted, just a little, like it was trying to shift in the frame. Her eyes looked hollow, as though something dark had filled them. Her own face seemed too pale, the shadows under her eyes deep and bruised. But it was more than that. There was something else in the reflection, something she couldn't place. She reached out, her trembling fingers brushing the cool surface of the glass. But the moment her fingers made contact, her reflection didn't follow. It stayed, frozen, and for a split second, the reflection smiled. The smile wasn't hers. It wasn't hers at all. Sarah stumbled back, horrified. The mirror was now just a reflection of her wide, fearful eyes, but in that moment, she knew something in this house was alive. And it wasn't just the walls that were breathing. In the silence that followed, Sarah could hear nothing but the pounding of her heart. She spun around, eyes darting from one corner to the next, searching for anything that could explain what was happening. The house felt like it was watching her, waiting, ready to consume her body and soul. And then, just as she turned toward the stairs to head up to the attic, there it was again. That sound, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving toward her. But there was no one there, not anymore. The house, once a forgotten relic of time, was no longer just a structure. It had become something far worse, a creature of its own making. The walls no longer simply breathed. They gasped, like lungs struggling to take in air. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, something suffocating, pressing in on Sarah's chest as she moved through the hallways. The marks on the floor were growing, expanding in strange patterns, forming a network of symbols that seemed to pulse with life, as if they were trying to form a map or a warning. The shadows that had once just lurked in the corners now moved, creeping along the floor like crawling hands, reaching for her, brushing against her ankles. Every corner she turned, they were there, closer, more defined. And the whispering, oh, the whispering, it wasn't just voices anymore. It was her voice, her own voice calling her name, coaxing her, urging her to come closer, to follow the path the house had set before her. With every step, Sarah felt the house closing in, suffocating her, as though it were trying to swallow her whole. The air had grown thick, damp, and heavy, with a sense of dread that hung in the corners, in every shadow. She couldn't tell where the house ended, and she began. Her mind, once clear, was slipping away. She wasn't sure anymore if the footsteps she heard were her own, or if something else was moving in the house with her. The sound of her own breathing seemed muffled, like she was underwater. She'd stop to listen, straining to hear through the oppressive silence. But then she'd hear it again, a soft shuffle of feet, the lightest of steps, just behind her. She spun around, but there was no one. No one but the shadows that stretched longer with every passing second. The longer she stayed in the house, the more she felt its grip on her mind. Was she imagining things? Had she really heard her voice whispering her name, or was it something else entirely? Was she just cracking under the pressure of the isolation, or was it the house that had begun to take control of her thoughts? Sarah stopped at a window and stared out into the inky blackness, trying to steady herself, to focus. But the longer she stood there, the more she realized that the house was warping the world outside as well. The streetlights, those once comforting pools of light, now seemed distorted, bending at unnatural angles. The trees swayed in ways that didn't make sense, twisting and contorting like they were alive. And the darkness beyond the window, it wasn't like the night she knew. It was wrong. It was a void, a chasm that stretched on forever. She turned away, heart racing, unable to escape the sick feeling in the pit of her stomach. Her own reflection in the glass seemed off, distorted, like a mirror that didn't quite reflect reality. She wasn't sure which was worse, the reflection that didn't look like her, or the one that did. It was then that the house offered her something, an answer, a clue. It came in the form of a room she had not seen before, a room that hadn't been there the last time she passed by. The door, slightly ajar, beckoned her, the faintest light spilling from within. She stepped through, her breath shallow, her heart in her throat. And there it was, the source of all her terror, the journal, the one she had found earlier, sitting on a desk at the center of the room. But something was different about it now. The journal had changed. Its pages were no longer yellowed, no longer brittle. The ink was dark, fresh, as though someone had just written in it. Her hand trembled as she opened to the last entry. It was in her own handwriting again, but this time, the message was different. It read, "I am here. You cannot leave. I am the house. I am the one who watches you, the one who follows. You can't run. You can't hide. And when you find me, I will have you." A cold wave of realization washed over her. This wasn't some sick coincidence. This house had been waiting for her. It had been drawing her here, piece by piece, until she was trapped, until she was bound to it, body and soul. She slammed the journal shut, but the words had already burned themselves into her mind. She wasn't just in the house was in her. The more Sarah tried to run, the more the house twisted around her, ensnaring her in its maze. Every door she opened led to the same room. The walls shifted, warping her perception, until she couldn't tell what was real anymore. The house had become a place where logic no longer applied. She couldn't escape. Each path she took only led her deeper into the nightmare. She ran again, this time with no clear direction. The sound of her frantic footsteps echoed through the halls, but it was different now. They weren't just hers. They were joined by others, a soft shuffle in time with hers, like the steps of someone or something walking alongside her. She reached the attic door, the one she had passed by so many times before. This time, she knew what awaited her inside. The attic had always been there, just out of sight, just out of reach. Now, it was the only place left to go. The door creaked open, its hinges protesting the motion. The darkness inside the attic seemed to consume the light, pulling it in like a black hole. Sarah stepped inside, trembling, her eyes straining to adjust to the dark. And there it was, standing in the center of the room, a figure. At first it looked like a shadow, something blending with the dark, but as her eyes focused, she saw it clearly. A man. His back was to her, but she could see the contours of his body, his outline sharp and defined. He was tall, too tall, his frame impossibly thin. He didn't move, not at all. Her breath caught in her throat. This man. He was wearing her clothes. He turned slowly, his face obscured by shadows, but she could see the glint of something shiny in his hand. It was a knife, an old, rusted blade, but the way he held it, the way he looked at her, it was like he knew her, like he had always been waiting for her. Sarah backed away, stumbling, her mind racing. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. This was the thing that had been following her, the thing in the shadows, in the whispers. It had always been here, always watching, waiting. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned to flee, but the door to the attic slammed shut behind her. The darkness pressed in from all sides, the air thick with an oppressive weight. The figure didn't move toward her, not yet. He just stood there, watching, waiting for her to come closer. And Sarah understood then what she had feared all along. She wasn't trapped in the house, she had become part of it. And now it was time for the house to claim her soul. The house stood silent now, as if holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for someone. But in the wake of Sarah's disappearance, it had not yet released its grip. Outside, the storm had passed, but the dark, oppressive energy that had permeated the air still lingered like a shadow that refused to leave. Days passed before anyone came looking for Sarah. The locals had heard rumors of her disappearance. The house had stood untouched for so long, and now it was almost as if it was calling out, beckoning anyone brave enough to venture inside. But those who had heard the whispers of the old house knew better than to cross its threshold. Only one person dared. Detective Sarah Hawkins, a woman known for her no-nonsense approach and an iron will, was assigned to the case. She had seen the signs, heard the whispers, but she believed in reason, in facts. No amount of local superstition was going to stop her from solving this. But as she arrived at the house, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind, the trees, the night, everything was waiting for something to happen. When she first stepped inside, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The house was decaying, sure, and there was an eerie coldness to it, but no evidence of foul play. There was no sign of Sarah, no blood, no struggle. But there was something else, a presence. It was as though the house itself was aware of the intrusion, and it was watching, waiting. Hawkins made her way through the house methodically, checking every room, every nook and cranny. But as she reached the attic, the very place where Sarah's torment had reached its peak, she found it. The air was thick in the attic, the floorboards creaking beneath her as she stepped forward. And there, in the middle of the room, was a broken lantern, its shattered glass still glimmering faintly. But more chilling than that was the figure slumped on the floor. It was Sarah, or what was left of her. She was lying on the cold floor, unblinking, unseeing. Her eyes were wide open, but there was nothing in them. The life, the soul, the spark of who she once was, gone. She was in a catatonic state, her body frozen, as if she had been trapped in time. Her hands, curled up against her chest, were covered in strange, deep scratches, as if she had been clawing at herself, at the walls, at her very mind. But it was the words that filled Sarah's mouth that chilled Hawkins to her very core. She wasn't speaking in coherent sentences. The words were disconnected, like fragments of a dream, disjointed, broken. The only phrase that made sense, that repeated over and over again, was this: "It's never over, over and over," in a voice barely above a whisper, like a prayer, a warning. Detective Hawkins didn't know what to make of it. She had seen many things in her years on the force, horrors that no one should ever witness, but this was something else entirely. Something that went beyond her understanding, beyond anything that could be explained by logic. The note, found in Sarah's pocket, was the only clue she could hold on to. It was a crumpled, faded scrap of paper. Scrawled in frantic, almost illegible handwriting, it simply said, "It's never over." It didn't make sense. If Sarah had been the victim of some kind of psychotic breakdown, if she had been exposed to the psychological horrors of the house, why this? Why had she written this note so clearly, so deliberately, unless she had known something more, something that Hawkins couldn't yet grasp? The walls seemed to breathe again, even in the stillness of the attic. The house felt alive, as if it had absorbed Sarah's terror, her fear, her descent into madness. Hawkins could feel the weight of it pressing down on her as she stood there, surrounded by the remnants of Sarah's ordeal. And she realized, with a sudden, crushing weight, that the house had never really been about Sarah. It wasn't just the house that had trapped her. It was something darker, something older. And it wasn't done, not by a long shot. Hawkins could hear the whispers again, faint but undeniable, rising from the shadows curling into her mind. They were faint at first, like the echoes of a distant conversation, but then they grew louder. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and the door to the attic slammed shut behind her. She spun around, a chill creeping up her spine, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the silence, the oppressive, suffocating silence. And then she heard the soft sound of footsteps, her footsteps, echoing from somewhere deep within the house. Slow, deliberate, methodical, they were coming closer. But Sarah Hawkins didn't move. She couldn't. She stood frozen in place, staring into the darkness as the footsteps grew louder, as if someone, or something, was drawing closer to her. The whispers intensified too. They were all around her now, too many voices to count, all speaking at once. Some were clear, some muffled, but all were insistent. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. And then she heard it, the final whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "It's never over." Hawkins turned toward the door. She had to leave. She had to escape. The house. It wasn't done with her yet. It was pulling her in, dragging her into its twisted web, and she was powerless to stop it. When Hawkins finally stepped outside into the cold, gray morning light, she realized that the house hadn't just taken Sarah. It had become her. Or perhaps it had always been her, or she'd been part of it all along. The note, the cryptic words, the whispers, it was all connected, but in a way that was beyond Hawkins' ability to understand. Was the house cursed? Was it alive in some way? Was it feeding off fear, like Sarah had experienced? Or was it something darker, something older, something that had been around long before Sarah ever arrived? The truth? The truth lay buried in the shadows of the house, in the twisting corridors of her own mind. Hawkins could never know for certain. What she did know was this: the house was still standing. It was still waiting, and no matter how far away you ran from it, it would always find you. As she left the house behind, Hawkins felt that oppressive weight lifting for just a moment, but only for a moment. It was then that she realized she was being watched from the shadows of the trees, from the far-off corners of her mind. Something was watching her. Something had always been watching, and she could never outrun it. The nightmare had followed her home. Was it the house that haunted them, or was it something darker? Something older? The truth may never be fully known, because some horrors are too deep to understand. Some nightmares go beyond time, beyond reason, and once they've taken root in your mind, they never leave. It's never over. As you leave tonight, remember, not all horrors are confined to the dark corners of the world. Some follow you home, and they never truly leave. If you want to hear more stories that will keep you up at night, subscribe and turn on the bell. You won't want to miss the horrors yet to come. What do you think happened to Sarah? Was it the house, or something much worse? Leave your theories in the comments below. Next time, we'll uncover the mystery of a place even darker than this one. Trust me, you won't sleep until you hear it.